Hey there! The Smith Morra Gambit is a very interesting weapon for white to try to crush black. So today we're gonna learn a few traps for white in this gambit, but we're also gonna learn how you can avoid it as black or how to set up a nice trap against it. So let's start with the first trap for white. So we get this gambit after e4, c5, white goes for d4, and after c takes, white's main idea is not to take on d4 because this will help black develop and attack the queen, but the main idea is to go c3, sacrificing a pawn to gain a very quick development. So we after black takes, knight takes. The main idea of the gambit is that white's pieces are already fairly active, even the bishops are already controlling a lot of squares, and black has some trouble to develop. For example, black would love to play knight to f6, but in this position the move e5 attacks the knight, and the knight doesn't have anything better than to retreat. So with that in mind, a natural idea for black might be to go d6 before going knight to f6, but here we're gonna play the move bishop to c4, and here the very natural move knight to f6 is not very good because we can still play the move e5, and the main point is that after black takes, we take with the bishop, we give a check, we deflect the king, and after king takes, we take the queen on d8. So after knight to f6 and e5, taking on e5 is not the best. In any case, white gets a very good position even if black plays the best moves. Black can try going to d7, but this will block the other pieces. This is the main problem for black in this line, to catch up with development. In that line, white has a few options like taking on d6, or knight to g4 might be another idea, attacking the pawn e5, and here white also has a few options, but the move e6 is quite interesting, setting up another trap. Black cannot take on e6, because white will simply take the knight on g4. So here black's best tries to go knight to e5, defending on f7. Here we can still take on f7, and after knight takes, we can continue developing. White has great compensation for the pawn, a lot of development, and a much easier position to play. So let's move on to the next trap. After e4, c5, d4, black takes, and we go c3. Black takes, and after knight takes, so we see that developing the knight on f6 is quite a bit complicated. That's why in this position, black very often goes knight to c6. This is the most common move in the position. From white's side, the main moves are pretty much always the same. The knight goes to f3, the bishop normally goes to c4, that's why here we can play the move knight to f3. So here black might try to go d6, to then plan to develop the knight to f6. Now black has more pieces controlling the e5 square, so here we're gonna go bishop to c4 again, and after knight to f6, it seems that black is able to develop without any troubles, but again we're gonna play the move e5, attacking the knight. And in this position, again, the best move for black is to move the knight, for example go to g4. In that line we can simply take on d6. White has much better coordination and great development for the pawn, because if black takes on e5, black is gonna have a lot of troubles. First of all, taking with the knight is really bad because after knight takes and d takes, we again get the bishop sacrifice on f7, and after king takes, white picks up the queen. Or another try by black might be to take on e5 with the pawn, but this is also not a good idea for black, because here we're gonna trade queens. Even though black has 2 extra pawns, white will have a very strong initiative. After king takes, the king is gonna be quite exposed, and after knight to g5, white is already starting to collect some material back, and white will continue attacking the king, so this is a better position for white. So the other try might be to take with the knight, but in this position we're gonna go knight to b5, planning to fork on c7, and white has a much better position. The best defense for black is to go rook to b8, but here white starts getting the material back with knight takes e5, knight to c7, checkmate is a big threat, so black has to go e6, and then after bishop to f4, this position is just great for white. But here black has tried to be clever and even set up a trap for white, so the idea is to go bishop to e6, trying to counter-attack. Very often this is a great idea, but in this case with correct play, white will also get an advantage. The main point is that after bishop takes and knight takes, the knight will cover the c7 square. So here we're gonna go knight to c7, and after king to d7 and knight takes, black's idea is to pick up the bishop on c4. So if now black manages to pick up the knight, black will get 2 minor pieces for the rook, so black will be doing fine, but in this position we get another fork with the move knight takes e5. We give a check, and after the king moves, white will pick up the knight and get a winning position. So in this line after knight to c6, d6, going for knight to f6 is going to be quite troublesome for black, because after e5, white gets a very strong initiative. That's why here black tried to develop with the move bishop to g4, but here white has another very strong continuation, which is the move bishop takes f7, and after king takes, knight to g5, we give a check, and then we collect the bishop on g4, white will get the material back, and black's king is going to be very exposed. So that's why after e4, c5, d4, we get the Morra Gambit, and then after knight to c6, knight to f3, d6 and bishop to c4. Here black very often plays the move e6, and after bishop to c4, black goes for the move d6. So before developing the knight on g8, white goes for e6 and d6. So in this position we're going to castle, and after knight to f6, the move queen to e2. This is a very common setup in the Morra Gambit. The rook is ready to come to the d file, and after bishop to e7 and rook to d1, in this position black has to be very careful. Here the most common move is e5. Now you're gonna see why, because it will prevent a very strong idea by white. Because after black castles, so here black played very natural moves, but white is already in trouble. We again go for the move e5, attacking the knight. Now the pawn on d6 is pinned, so black has to move the knight. Knight to e8 is the best try, because after we take on d6, now there's gonna be a lot of pressure. Black has only one move to stay in the game after bishop takes. Here white can go knight to d5. Here white has a lot of compensation for the pawn. One idea might be to take the bishop on d6 and white will get the bishop pair. But the other capture, which looks more natural, knight takes to activate the knight on e8, which is very passive, is actually quite bad, because after bishop to f4, white gets a lot of pressure on black's position. Now knight to e4, knight to b5 is coming, the knight on d6 is pinned, so white is going to win material. For example, after the move queen to c7, white can simply take on d6, and after bishop takes, knight to b5 will fork the queen and the bishop, so white is going to win a minor piece. And before I move on to analyze some ideas for black in this gambit, if you want to seriously improve at chess besides knowing opening tricks, I have a free course that will provide you with a training plan for that, so feel free to check the link in the description. Alright, so let's rotate the board to analyze this position from black side. After the moves e4, c5, d4, we take, and after white goes for the move c3, there's a very simple idea to avoid this gambit, which is to go knight to f6. So the main problem in this gambit for black is to develop this knight, so we can do it at once if we give the pawn back. So here we attack the pawn e4, so white's best try here is to go e5, but now we can bring the knight to the center after knight to d5, and here white will sooner or later take on d4. For example, after c takes d4, now we can go for d6, we put pressure on the center, this knight will develop to c6, we actually transpose into another line in the Sicilian defense, which is the L-up variation, and this is a very playable line for black. So knight to f6 pretty much neutralizes this gambit, but if you wanna go for the gambit, black has a very interesting trap. After d takes and knight takes, knight to c6, and after knight to f3, we go for the move e6, and after bishop to c4, the move queen to c7 is quite interesting. The queen might be eyeing the bishop on c4, but as we'll see, it has another very important idea, which is to attack the king if white castles. So in this position, if white goes for the main plan, which is to castle and then go queen to e2 and rook to d1, now we're gonna play knight to f6. We see another advantage of the queen on c7, it is controlling e5, so here after e5, black can simply take the pawn e5, and after the move queen to e2, which is what white normally plays in this line, here black would actually even go for the move d6, but the move knight to g4 is a very interesting move, setting up a very clever trap. So in this position, going for the move rook to d1 might be possible, but black's idea is to go bishop to c5 as well, putting pressure on f2. With that in mind, white might want to kick away this knight with the move h3, but out of nowhere, here comes the shocker, knight to d4, we want to deflect the knight on f3, we are attacking the queen, and the main point is that after knight takes and queen to h2, we get a checkmate. So after the moves h3 and knight to d4, the relatively best to avoid the checkmate is to take the knight, but after knight takes and bishop takes, black has a clearly better position. So in this position, after the move queen to e2, knight to g4 is actually a very tricky move. Just want to mention that here white has a few options, but the safest is to go knight to b5, controlling d4, so now knight to d4 is not possible anymore. White is also attacking the queen. The queen can go to b8, keeping an eye on this diagonal, but now white can go for the move h3. In any case, now the knight can go to the e5 square, so this is actually quite a playable position for black. So you now know a lot of traps in this gambit for white, but you also know this very interesting line for black, and you also know how to avoid this gambit as black if you don't want to face it. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.